So on this channel, I've talked a little bit about the various fantasy books that I've published, but there is a different, much less polished book that I want to talk about today. And even though it's an embarrassing story, I want to really share a lot of details about what it was like to write my very first book, which is down here in this cupboard. And that book is the Aeon Academy. Now, in this video, I want to really just share my process of what it was like to write this very first book, and hopefully pull out of this some key lessons that might be useful for you if you're in this process of starting out and writing your very first story as well. Because I think that looking back on this experience, there are a lot of things that I wish I had known when I was starting out on what has turned into a lifelong passion and pursuit for telling stories. So just to give a bit of background, the way that this story started is that, as I was growing up as a kid, I just loved reading. I loved reading fantasy books. I would read, just hours and hours and hours every day. And I guess I had always had it in my head that, one day it would be really cool to maybe write a story, to maybe take all the stories that I had read and to try to create something that was my own. But I had never really gotten around to it. And then I remember vividly, I was in high school, I was in year 9, so I was 15 years old at the time. And we'd just come back from school holidays, a 2-week break, we'd come back. And one of my classmates had actually taken a short story that he had written over the break. And he'd written this maybe 6,000, 7,000 word short story over the break. And he had done this off his own passion. He hadn't done this because there was an assignment about it. He had just done it because he was interested in exploring this story and seeing where it went. And I remember talking to him about this and just seeing the kind of excitement that he had had to pursue this idea and thinking, man, that would be pretty cool to do. So I went home from school that day, and that very day I started writing the very first draft of the Aeon Academy, and I never really looked back since then. I basically wrote it, almost every day for the next year or so, and after exactly 360 days, I had a completed first draft of this story. Now you might be wondering, what is this story about? And that's where I get to the very first embarrassing confession of this video, because when I was starting out, I don't think I had a lot of originality. And basically this story was Harry Potter, but set at a school for superheroes instead of wizards. So my main character, Wayne Holton, was this orphan boy who discovers that he has the superpower to control his density, so he can make himself heavier or lighter. And he basically gets recruited to go off to this secret school where all these superheroes train. And it was pretty much like the most wish fulfillment story that I could possibly have imagined. I think that when I went to primary school in my younger years, I hadn't had a great time there. I struggled to fit in. I had a lot of people who were bullying me. And when I went off to high school, I remember feeling such a sense of hope that this was a fresh start, that this was an opportunity to just really, change myself and to hopefully surround myself with people who, actually were genuine friends with me and genuinely cared about me. And I think that it was that emotional underpinning which made this story so cathartic for me to write, because this is a story about this young orphan who has never really had anyone that he can relate to, anyone that cares for him before. And now all of a sudden he is taken off to this superhero school where everyone is an oddity like him. Everyone has these strange powers and these strange abilities. And at this school, he somehow manages to get recruited into the Guard, which is this elite team of superheroes there who basically defend the city that the story is set in. And that is basically the setup for the story. This young boy goes off and he is recruited into this superhero team, kind of like the Avengers, but they're all like 12 to 16-year-olds. And it was just this school story influenced by my love of Harry Potter, a massive influence through there, and stories like Sky High as well, which is this great coming-of-age superhero story. And I remember just feeling so excited to write this story. It was amazing to come home every day after school and to be able to kind of take my school experiences, which were enjoyable. I had some great friends at high school, friends that I'm still close with to this day, and to take those kind of experiences there and then to mold it into this story instead. And it was just such a joy, and I felt like I had finally discovered my calling. It felt incredible, and this was pretty much what I would work on for the next couple of years. In fact, for the rest of high school, from year 9, 10, 11, 12, I was just working on the Aeon Academy all the time. And I look back on this story, which has a bit of an unfortunate water stain on the front there. But I look back on this story with such fondness because in a lot of ways, it almost felt like I grew up with Wayne and I grew up with the other friends that he had in this story, because in a sense I did. I started writing him when I was 15 and I kept writing him as I was 16, 17, 18, like as I was growing older. I realized, and this was a very hard realization that I got to, I realized after working on this story for several years that as much as I loved Wayne and as much as I loved this story, it just wasn't quite there. And I didn't quite have the skill as a writer to produce it in the way that I wanted. And I had to make a very difficult decision after a couple of years of rewriting this thing from scratch several times as to whether I kept pursuing this story, whether I tried to get it published, or whether I kind of let it go and move on to something else. And that, I will leave you in a little bit of suspense as to what I did just there, because I think it's really important to kind of pull a few lessons out of this to hopefully help you if you're in a similar situation to this. Because I think it's very easy if you're starting out as an author, and this might be the situation that you're in, to compare the first drafts that you're writing, the kind of scrappy, messy first drafts that you're writing, to something that is done by an author with maybe decades of writing experience, that has gone through an editorial team, that has gone through several revisions and drafts. And I guess what I really want to share is that that stuff takes a while to get to that point, because my story just wasn't there. I remember in the very first draft that I wrote for the Aeon Academy, my main kind of antagonist was only introduced about 80 or 90% of the way through the story, which is far too late to kind of introduce your main antagonist. And there were just a lot of other amateur rookie mistakes like that I made. Like I said, a lot of it was wish fulfillment. A lot of it was kind of hoping that I would get whisked off to something like Hogwarts or to a superhero school myself, which obviously never happened. But I think that really brings me to the first principle that I think you can really learn from this if you're in the process of writing your first story now. And that is the idea of focusing on joy, focusing on enjoyment of the writing process. There's going to be plenty of time later in your writing career, in your writing journey, to start thinking about things like the marketability of a book, or how it fits into kind of the publishing space, or whether readers will like it, or all of those sort of considerations, which are valid to think about and explore. But I think for your first book, it's so critical to just focus on having this sense of excitement, to wake up every day, to come home from school or to come home from work or university or whatever it is you're doing with your life, and sit down in front of the computer and just let the characters take you where they might. And I know for a fact that it's because of that love I had for this process, that is why I am still writing today, 10 years on from when I started writing the Aeon Academy when I was 15. I'm 25 now, been doing it for 10 years, and I plan to keep doing it, hopefully for the rest of my life. And I think that comes from just not caring about publication, not caring about what readers will think, basically just trying to write something that is very selfish, something that is entirely for your own enjoyment. Doesn't matter if it's wish fulfillment. Heck, it doesn't even matter if it's like something like fan fiction, It can be whatever you want it to be. But the thing that it really should be is enjoyable for you. You should really, really focus on trying to enjoy that process. And it's funny, I'm thinking back as I say this to things that I haven't thought about in years. The fact that, I was literally drawing out like plans for how this school looked, or even plans for how the city that this story took place in looked. And all of that comes from just a deep passion for this process. So that's the first lesson. Really, really focus on writing something that is going to make you excited to show up to work on it every single day. And then the second lesson, which is sort of almost sounding a little bit opposed to that, is the importance of getting feedback. If you really want to progress as an author, it's so important to develop a strong feedback loop with your writing. And that was not something that I had. This was probably the biggest mistake that cost me years as a writer. And if I could go back and tell my younger self just one thing before he kind of embarked on this process of writing the Aeon Academy, I would probably tell him, be more willing to get feedback for this thing. And that's hard, because when you're writing a story, it feels so precious to you, right? It feels like, this is my baby. It just feels so important for me to protect this thing. But really, if you want to improve your story, if you want it to be as good as it possibly can be, and you actually want to pursue being a writer in a more serious way, you're never going to get that progress without having someone who you trust to provide feedback on your work. And that's why, I don't think the story succeeded. It's because I wrote the first draft, I sat on it, I didn't show it to anyone else. I rewrote it again from scratch. Then I rewrote it again from scratch. And there were probably 3 or 4 complete rewrites that I did of this story. Instead, what I think a better approach would have been is to try to put, the first couple of chapters up onto like a critique website online, or try to get some feedback from, people I trusted, maybe English teachers at school or friends who had experience writing. Just try to get a sense of what are my blind spots that I am not seeing of myself. The third principle is don't get attached. And I know that sounds, again, like a contradiction because I was just talking about the importance of writing something that you're so passionate about, something that you really love exploring. But at the same time, it's really important to recognize that for most writers, your first book is not going to be the first book that gets published. If you look at someone like Brandon Sanderson, he says that he wrote 12 unpublished books before he was ready to publish his first novel, before it was good enough for him to publish it. And I remember actually hearing that sort of when I was, in this process of starting out as a writer. And it was actually very liberating to me to know that, I don't actually have to get it right on the very first time. I've got potentially, a half dozen novels between me and getting something published. And that means that I can really take my time and just learning the craft and trying to master this skill and trying to progress as much as I possibly can as a writer. So even though you should be writing something that you really are enjoying and that you're really passionate about, at the same time, realize and recognize within yourself that you may have to move on to something else. You may have to progress to a different story in order to level up as a writer. And that's eventually what I had to do. I remember I was probably 19. I'd been writing the Aeon Academy for probably 4 years at that point. Lots of rewrites, lots of redrafting, lots of characters coming into the story and leaving the story and getting merged with each other and being destroyed, and just all of these sort of things that happen with your first book. And I realized, I can always come back to this story, but I feel like I'm stagnating as a writer and I'm not making progress. And I decided to move on to writing another book, which was Across the Broken Stars. And unlike the Aeon Academy, which took me 360 days to write the first draft, Across the Broken Stars only took me 60 days to write the first draft. And it was way cleaner, it was a much better story, and it ended up being something that I actually published. So it's very important to still commit yourself to going through the process. If you're writing your first book and you're thinking about giving up, don't do it. Just keep going, get the first draft done, try to do a couple of drafts of revision, because you learn a lot more from finishing a failure, if you want to call it that, rather than just abandoning these projects 10%, 20% of the way through. And then the very last lesson here, principle number 4, is to keep the beginner's mindset. I've mentioned how there is such a joy that comes from writing your very first book. You are feeling this creative freedom, this excitement that comes from having read all these stories in your life, and now you finally have this chance to create your own. And there are days when it feels absolutely magical, like you are just sitting down and this story is flowing out of you. And you are exploring these characters, you're growing up with these characters, they are feeling like real people to you. And I think it's so important to keep that beginner's mindset and that love for the joy of this process, this love for the magic that is happening when you write. And more than that as well, the beginner's mindset of realizing that I've got a lot to learn. You never really want to be in a position where you think you are an expert at something, because as soon as you think you know everything about a subject, it's impossible for you to learn anything more. So even the place where I'm at now, I certainly don't consider myself to be an expert author. I've published a couple of books, I had a best-selling video game come out last year, but even now I still recognize that there is so much room and opportunity for me to grow and continue learning and mastering this craft. And I think that that's the real beauty of writing. It's never something where you can say, that's it, I'm done. I've learned everything that there is to know about this thing. There is always another mystery for you to unravel. There is always a way that you can write something better. There's that saying that often gets tossed around that a story is never finished, only abandoned. And I think that every writer feels that way. So keep that beginner's mindset, whether you're writing your first book or your 10th. And to all of you who are with me in pursuit of great stories, to you I say, keep writing and keep striving. I'll see you in the next video.